can you confirm? I don't see any live streaming. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we know people are joining from everywhere in the world. My name is Pradeep Nayak. I'm at the University of Waterloo, and I'm also representing here the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership for Building Strong Small-Scale Fisheries. I will be the moderator and the host of this webinar today, so welcome, everyone. Before we start, I will do a few rounds of introductions, and then I will invite our speakers today to talk about the topic. The Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 partners representing the academia, government, non-government, and civil society organizations from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand and work on vulnerability and viability is not just to represent the economic aspects of it, but also to dive deeper into the political, the cultural, the ecological, and all other aspects of the fisheries. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key civil society, NGO, government, and university partners to enhance small-scale fisheries viability. In doing so, the B2B Global Partnership brings people, organizations, and institutions together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing vulnerability and viability issues within the small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series, for which we are all here today virtually, is a flagship initiative of the B2B Global Partnership. It has continued over the 5 years now as a collaborative platform to enable discussions on key topics, themes, and issues pertaining to vulnerability, viability, and transitions between the two within the context of small-scale fisheries, but also broadly. The B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will continue to be so during the year 2026 and beyond. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube, details regarding which can be available can be seen at www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. So this is a very special year for us. The thematic webinar series 2026 is dedicated to our B2B transitions case studies from countries in Asia and Africa. This dedicated series is created to offer a collaborative platform for us to share the case study experiences and outcomes. This will help garner feedback from within the B2B community and the network, but also from the larger global audience interested in small-scale fisheries. And this is apart from showcasing the rich B2B research that is taking place in Asia and Africa. Vulnerability and viability are among some of the many realities small-scale fisheries grapple with in their day-to-day experience. Just as vulnerable communities can strive to move towards viability, already strong and viable communities can revert back towards vulnerability under pressures from internal and external drivers and dynamics. In this context, our case study special thematic webinar series, which is starting today, will focus on vulnerability to viability transitions as a novel approach to highlight their interconnected nature, explore the potential for vulnerable small-scale fisheries to transition towards viability, and the processes through which these communities can retain their hard-earned viability without having to revert back towards vulnerability again. Over the next 15 months, starting in January today, researchers from the B2B Global Partnership countries in Africa and Asia will present their detailed case studies focusing on various dimensions of vulnerability and viability and the transitions between the two, and help further conceptual and methodological development of the B2B transitions approach. Today's webinar is the first in the series of B2B thematic webinars planned for the year 2026 and the 61st since January 2021 when it all started 5 years back, and we have continued since then. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Denise Warlanio Ahito and Dr. Evans Kawasi Ariji as our distinguished speakers for the 2026 inaugural talk today. Dr. Denise Warlanio Ahito is a professor of coastal ecology with specialty in coastal resource management and currently the acting vice chancellor of the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. He is also the B2B Global Partnership Country Coordinator for Ghana. Dr. Ahito's research interests and contributions are in the areas of coastal management, small-scale fisheries, maritime regulation and enforcement, conservation and management of coastal and marine water bodies. Dr. Ahito graduated from University of Cape Coast in 1998 with a Bachelor of Science in Biology and completed in 2002 a Master's of Science in Rural Development Studies from the Swedish Agricultural University in Uppsala. Further, he also has a MSc in Tropical Aquatic Ecology from the University of Bremen in Germany in 2004, where in 2008, Dr. Ahito completed a PhD in environmental science. Dr. Evans Kawasi Ariji is a fisheries scientist and a senior lecturer at the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences in the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. He is a lead researcher for the B2B case study in Ghana. He specializes in fisheries science, fish stock assessment, fish population dynamics, fisheries oceanography, bioecological modeling, marine protected areas, conservation and restoration of aquatic ecosystems in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Ariji graduated from UCC in 2009 with a Bachelor of Science in Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences in 2013 and an MPhil in aquaculture. In 2019, he received his PhD degree in biological and environmental sciences from the University of Rhode Island in the US. It is my honor now to invite Dr. Denise Warlanio Ahito and Dr. Evans Kawasi Ariji to deliver today's inaugural talk for the B2B thematic webinar series, January 2026. And the talk title will be Understanding Vulnerability in Two Coastal Communities of Ghana and Co-Creating Pathways to Their Viability and Resilience. So it is a pleasure to have you, and the stage is yours now. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Pratik Nayak. And I use this opportunity to also greet all the partners from around the world who are on this platform. It's certainly an honor for us, myself and Evans and the team back at the University of Cape Coast, specifically the Africa Center of Excellence in Coastal Resilience, to have been part of this project. And for today, having been welcomed to be the inaugural presenters or lecturers for this very interesting talk. We will be presenting our case study, focus on how we could understand or provide some entry measures into how two coastal communities, fishing communities, can move from vulnerability to viability through constructing pathways into resilience. This is a very important topic we're going to look at because there are several threats that jeopardize the safety, food security, and livelihood and well-being of coastal residents. Coastal communities certainly have the potential to adapt, but given the challenges they face with climate change, environmental degradation, and overfishing, it's extremely important that measures, including policy and other local interventions, are informed by science. So our work has proposed important pathways that can be considered as we move from vulnerability to viability within the coastal communities. And at this juncture, I want to emphasize that these are case studies that have been selected from 2 coastal communities, carefully selected to provide some important benchmarks into how migrant communities are able to adapt to these challenges that I've mentioned. And also, that is on the one side, on the other side, how indigenous communities are able to adapt. We are hoping that through this initiative, we'll be able to provide the contrast between successful and challenging times and locations along our coast. We also hope that these will serve as pilot case studies that can be scaled up into other coastal communities. Thank you for the opportunity. So at this juncture, I invite Dr. Evans Arizi to continue with the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Dennis Walanyo Heto, and then Professor Pratik Nayak. Thank you so much for giving me the platform to present our findings. Good afternoon from Ghana to all of you, those of you who are online and you are listening to me. Regards to you from Ghana. So as was indicated by Professor Heto and then Professor Nayak, I'm going to give a presentation on the topic, Understanding Vulnerability into Coastal Fishing Communities of Ghana and Co-Constructing Pathways to their Viability and Resilience. My presentation is going to follow this outline. So, according to FAO, in 2022, about 33.4 million fishes are currently working in the world. And when you come to Ghana, there are about 2.7 million fishes, representing 10% of the entire population working in the fisheries sector of Ghana. Now, among these fishes, 80% of them are small-scale fishes. Unfortunately, the fishes have their livelihoods being threatened by overfishing, environmental degradation, and climate change. And Ghana, you have so many fishing communities who are being subjected to facing these threats. Now, among these fishing communities, Anlo Beach and Ankobra, they are the key ones which are being affected by these threats. As a matter of fact, these threats have the potential to jeopardize the safety, food security, livelihood, and the well-being of coastal dwellers. And this was reported or observed by Lauria and his co-researchers, and that was in 2018. So coastal communities have the potential to adapt and have resources that can be optimized to make them become viable. So there are options for these coastal fishing communities to become viable if only they can pinpoint those factors that can help them to become viable. And so when we look at Ankobra and Anlo Beach, we felt there was a need for us to go in there and to mobilize knowledge so as to pinpoint the various factors that can help to make these communities viable. And so let me also indicate that at the moment, even though some studies have been done, they have not been able to come out clearly with the factors that can help to make these two communities viable. And so this study sought to ascertain, first of all, ascertain the factors that contribute significantly to the vulnerabilities of the two fishing communities. And then the second objective is to explore the possible ways that you can use to transition these two communities into a state of viability. Before I go to the methods that were deployed to gather data so as to pinpoint the various factors that can help to make these two communities viable, I want to walk you through some theoretical framework that is underlying this study. Now, if you look at the figure that is being projected, there are two scenarios. The first one is talking about the fact that a community can become vulnerable when some three factors, when they interact, depending on their nature, can make a community become vulnerable. And these are the three key factors that interact to influence or to lead to what vulnerability. Vulnerability is a function of these three factors. When you are talking about sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure. So sensitivity, let me begin with exposure. Exposure is where the community is exposed to certain hazards and certain dangerous, phenomena. And then the sensitivity is how sensitive are their livelihoods to the hazards that have occurred. And then the adaptive capacity is the ability to be able to cope with the hazards, better still, to recover from their state of vulnerability. Now, if the adaptive capacity is relatively low, while sensitivity and exposure are so great or are so high, then the community is vulnerable. On the other way, or let me say, if you look at the opposite, if the adaptive capacity is so great, so strengthened, so strong, whilst the sensitivity and exposure are low, then the community is either viable, or even if there's vulnerability, the vulnerability is more or less negligible. So that based on this principle that we conducted the research so as to identify factors that can make the community, the two communities, develop high adaptive capacity so as to withstand the various hazards that occur in these two communities. So we also, let me say, I worked with a team. We came out with a conceptual framework, and this conceptual framework was meant to capture the various variables that more or less, when measured, will be able to tell you whether the communities are vulnerable or not. So you have the environmental factors, you have the socioeconomic factors, you have the physical factors, and then you have the political factors interacting. So if they are able to interact well, and then the community is able to have high adaptive capacity, then the community will become viable. On the other side, when they are not able to have adaptive capacity, great adaptive capacity, in the face of the interaction among all these factors, then the community will become vulnerable. For instance, if you talk about environmental factors, if the degradation is ongoing, climate change is becoming pronounced, flood is all over, erosion, pollution, then there's going to be a problem. And then political factors, if the governance is so poor, then the community is going to be in danger of facing vulnerability. And in the big instances where there can be corruption, transparency is lacking, all these can contribute to their vulnerability. And then when we look at social factors, when people are poor, their livelihood is not sustainable, and then some people are marginalized when it comes to decision making and all that, it will go a long way to make the community become vulnerable. So the study was conducted in June. And as I said, it was specifically done in Anlo Beach and Ankobra communities in Ghana. And these communities were chosen based on the outstanding occurrence of flooding and erosion in these communities. And we employed mixed method for the data collection, talking about qualitative and then collection of qualitative data and then quantitative data. So this is a map to show the locations of the two communities. This is a map of West Africa showing exactly where Ghana is. And then this is, so here is the A is where the Ankobra community is located. And then the B is where Anlo Beach is located. So these are the specific maps to zoom out the locations of this community. So if you look at the Anlo Beach, it's spread along the coast, whilst Ankobra, only a small portion is located right beside the coast. So during the study, a household survey was conducted in the two communities to obtain information on the socio-ecological resilience and then adaptive capacity of the coastal communities. So we used questionnaire and then in-depth interview guides to gather the data. And we didn't just settle on any sample size anyhow, but we used Yamin formula to arrive at the sample size based on which data were gathered. And so in total, 436 respondents were randomly sampled for face-to-face interviews. I mean, they were contacted for interview. But before the data were gathered, we were able to map the various houses. And then we assigned IDs to the households or the houses before we even got to the field. So through the technique of or with the help of GIS, we were able to pinpoint the various houses, and then, as I said, you were able to assign IDs to them. And so when we got there, you were using GPS to go to the various houses to identify the household heads so as to speak to them and elicit information, or to interview them and elicit information. So in our Long Beach, 263 people in all were contacted for information. And then for Ankobra, 173 people were contacted. And as I said, all these numbers were based on the population size of each community. As part of the study, we also did focus group discussions where some members of the communities were gathered, and we asked them a couple of questions to elicit relevant information from them. And for each discussion group, we had about 10 people in the group. We also contacted some key people to elicit information from them. In fact, for each community, we were able to contact 2 key people to get detailed information from them. And we also used drone to map out the human settlements, vegetation covers, and then water bodies surrounding the 2 communities. So this was how vulnerability was computed or calculated. As I said, vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, exposure of the community to hazards, and then sensitivity of their livelihood to the hazard or to the situation. And then their adaptive capacity denoted in this equation by A. And so this equation was originated by or developed by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we used this equation to determine the vulnerability of the 2 communities. The various parameters have been defined here. And then to ensure that all the indicators were comparable, to be able to compare all the indicators because they were in their various units, we did what is called normalization. We normalized the data to 0 to 1 scale using the formula provided by IPCC, and that has been projected here. X is the original indicator, okay? So if you talk about maybe poverty could be X. If you talk about, let's say, degradation is represented by X. So the various factors that were considered talk about even the hazards, the extent of the hazards. We are talking about erosion, talking about flooding and all that. They are represented by X in this case. This was how the exposure index was computed. It's just arithmetic mathematics, where you have the sum of all the indicators for exposure, and then divided by the number of those indicators. And of course, those indicators are the normalized exposure ones. So let me say normalized exposure indicators were those that were considered in computing the exposure index. The sensitivity index was also computed similar to the exposure index. It's just arithmetic mathematics. And I strongly believe that almost all of you who are listening to me know how to calculate arithmetic mean. So that was exactly what we did. And then adaptive capacity was also calculated in similar fashion. So I tried to project the vulnerability of the communities based on the current situation or the status quo to see what is going to happen over time. And then, so viability was computed. And here, viability is a proxy. Let me say adaptive capacity. In this case, it's a proxy for viability. So with that in mind, viability was able to, I was able to deduce, or you were able to deduce viability from the vulnerability equation. And the various parameters have been defined here. So the respondents, majority of them were females. These were some of the results that we obtained from the field. In both communities, the females were more than the males. And that is an indication that for household heads, many of them are females in these communities. And see, in the fishery sector in Ghana, in most cases, the women sponsor the men to do fishing. So this is not surprising that the women are all the more, majority of the women are heads for most of the households in these two communities. And then in terms of age, majority of the respondents were within the age bracket of 31 to 50 in most cases. For their education level, many of them had basic education and then informal education, but a few of them had secondary and tertiary education. And then we wanted to find out whether they were natives or not, so as to ensure that right information and data were being gathered. So it came out that majority of the people that we contacted for information were natives. They were natives of those two communities. And then we also tried to look at the marital status of the fishing communities. And we found out that most of them were married. And then a few of them were single. Interestingly, some of them were cohabiting. I think the men were not ready to pay the how do you call it, the bride price. Yeah, so some of them were cohabiting. That was interesting to come across. And then it was quite obvious. We wanted to look at their primary occupations. It was clear that majority of them were into the fishing or fishery business. Especially the majority of them were doing fishing. In Anlo Beach, majority of them were into fishing. And then we tried to also find out whether there were any good income. So we computed, or we looked at the average monthly salary, and for Ankobra, they had a low, or let me say among the two, they had the lower, how do you call it, lower salary. Okay, the income that they were getting was relatively low as compared to those at Anlo Beach. Now, when you look at it in the angle of per day, you realize that Ankobra, they were getting, each person was getting, on average, each person was getting around $3 per day. whilst for Anlo Beach, they were getting some value around, well, a little bit around $4 per day, which is not all that bad because they have crossed, or they are getting something beyond $1 a day. So at least it's somehow better than what is prevailing elsewhere. And then you wanted to find out if people had specialized skills. So, I mean, once you have other skills and then you're out of business, fishing business, at least you can have something to follow. So we try to look at that, and it came out that a lot of the people that we contacted for information, they didn't really have specialized skills, and that could put them in a state of vulnerability. Because once you don't have other skills and then you're out of fishing business, it's going to be very difficult for you to have something to rely on. We also looked at the hazards that were occurring in the two communities. And it came out clearly that flooding has been an issue in the two communities. Flooding came out tall among all the three key hazards that have been occurring in those communities. So erosion turned out to be the second most prevailing hazard in the two communities. And of course, pollution was recognized as a hazard that was not so threatening to them. So you try to look at the degree of occurrence, whether they were occurring rarely, frequently, or occasionally. Now, in Anlo Beach, or at Anlo Beach, erosion and flooding occur occasionally or on occasional basis, whilst pollution rarely occurs. But for Ankobra, pollution occurs frequently, and it's not surprising because there is an illegal mining that is ongoing, and so there is this estuary that is close to where the community is. And so when the illegal activities take place upland, their wastewater drains all the way into the ocean where the community is. And so these communities, they derive they catch fish in the estuary. They depend on the estuarine fisheries as well. And so now that the water is polluted, it has become a problem for them. But if you look at the two communities, they all agreed that erosion and flooding have been occurring on an occasional basis. And then you also try to look at the damage that these hazards cause to either their lives, to their livelihoods, to their properties, or whether they were getting injuries. And it came out clearly that anytime the hazards occur, particularly erosion and then flooding, people's properties or infrastructure were being destroyed. And then it also came to light that their livelihoods were being lost. And then in some cases, some people also gave the information that in some cases, there were losses of lives and then some injuries, which is not really good. And that something needs to be done to prevent or to avoid all these problems in these communities. We also try to look at whether their food security was great. It came out that they were moderately and severely food insecure, and they struggle to get food in most cases. I mean, the two communities, they struggle to get food, which is not a good thing. It's not a good situation. So we try to compute or to determine the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, as well as vulnerability. And then these were the figures. So if you look at Ankobra, Ankobra is relatively of high vulnerability as compared to, let me say, the vulnerability of Ankobra to hazards is higher than that of Anlo Beach. And that is not surprising. As I said, they are close to the estuary, very close to the estuary. And then the estuary sometimes, during the high tide, water even enters some of their houses. And then the estuary that they rely on for fisheries is also polluted. Coupled with that, sometimes the sea enters at high tide, it enters some of their compound, some of their kitchens where they smoke their fish. So there's a big problem at Ankobra community. As for Anlo Beach, they are somehow okay. I mean, their adaptive capacity is relatively better, so they're able to withstand some of these hazards. So we try to, with the help of GIS, to look at the various households where we gathered data from. Okay, and then so these are the various households. Those look like let me say hexagons, right? Represent the various households. And then they have been color coded. The pink is for moderate, and then the mauve is for high, and it ranges from 0. Let me begin with the low, let me say the low scale. That is from 0 to 0.33 represents low. And then from 0.33 to 0.66 represents moderate. That's moderate vulnerability. And then from 0.66 to 1 means a high vulnerability. Now, so if you look at the hexagons, when you look at them, you realize that for Ankobra, they fall within the moderate vulnerability. That's a moderate vulnerability. And then the same was reported for or was observed for Anlo Beach. These are the keys similar to Ankobra. So they also fall within moderate vulnerability. So Ankobra is, Anlo Beach is relatively vulnerable. That's moderately vulnerable. So as it stands, it tells you that these two communities are moderately vulnerable and that they are not all that viable. They are not viable. And that something needs to be done about that. So for instance, of poor house structures, no groins to more or less prevent the water from entering their homes. And if you look at the environmental factors, some of the plants like mangroves have been cut down, degraded, and then the water that they rely on for fisheries. The waters have been polluted, and then climate change is also prevailing. Erosion is all over, pollution. And then for socioeconomic factors, livelihood is not all that sustainable, because once the flood comes, or the erosion comes, they lose their livelihood until the impact of the hazards is over. And so as it stands, they are vulnerable, moderately vulnerable. And there is also poor governance. I remember you were speaking to some of them, and they indicated that in some instances, when the government brings some goodies to them to be shared among the residents, some leaders more or less channel the goodies to their homes. They don't give them to, or they don't share among the residents. So there's more sort of corruption prevailing in the communities. There's lack of transparency. And then institutional capacity is also poor. Once there is a disaster, when there's a disaster, the institutions that are responsible to respond, to remedy the situation, they don't really come on time. I mean, in some instances, when they come, they are helpless. They can't even help the situation. So these are some of the things that we encountered. I mean, you saw. I mean, some of the things that the households told us, and it is not really good. So I tried to project the current vulnerability, the current vulnerability into the future to see what is going to happen. So if nothing is done about it, this is going to continue like that in this trajectory, and that is not really good for the Ankobra community. And it's the case for Anlo Beach. If something is not done about it, if government does not intervene, if some measures are not put in place, these two communities are going to be vulnerable, and their vulnerability is going to follow this trajectory. So with interaction with them, it came to light that if rocky drawings are constructed to go a long way to prevent the water from reaching them, and then when responsible mining is also done, their waters will not be polluted, or waters surrounding their communities will not be polluted, so they'll be able to exploit fish from those water bodies for survival, for living. And then in terms of pollution, when there is proper disposal of refuse or rubbish, their water systems around them will not be polluted. And they were also of the view that when there are sustainable agricultural and fishing practices, the fish stocks will not be depleted. So at any point in time, when they go for fishing, that's in the case of fishing, I mean, fish stocks, when they go for fishing, they'll be able to get fish, come home to sell. And then when they go into cultural practices, they will also have food in their homes. And so they will not be food insecure. Aside that, income will be flowing from the fishing businesses, and even agricultural businesses. When they harvest their produce or their products, they will sell and get something from that. They were also of the view that when there are certain, more or less, savings for them, and then if they can also access loans, that will also help them in terms of health. In terms of health, if they have good health insurance, more or less schemes, they will be able to benefit from them, and that anytime they are sick, they'll be able to access good quality, quality health care. And then if they're able to form, how do you call it, maybe groups, associations, so that they'll be helping one another. That will also go a long way to help them. I think some of them also were talking about the fact that institutions that come to their rescue whenever there is a disaster, if they are well equipped, they will also play their part to ensure that their communities will not be vulnerable. So when these measures and other measures that are deemed necessary are put in place, that will go a long way to make these communities viable. See, for instance, if you have good uh, ways of disposing waste, if people are doing responsible mining, mangroves are being replanted, or reforestation is taking place, and then for socioeconomic factors, if their livelihoods are sustainable, and then there's gender empowerment, social protection schemes, the savings, loans are easily accessible, and they form associations where they can benefit financially from. That will go a long way to help them. And then in terms of politics, I mean, politically, if there's good governance, there's transparency, corruption is rooted out, it's avoided, it's taken out. And then there's institutional capacity where those institutions that when they are in danger, when there's a disaster, will come to their rescue on time, swiftly, well equipped. And then in terms of fiscal structures, when they have good housing conditions, and then the groins are constructed, it will go a long way to move them from a state of vulnerability to a state of viability. So I have this to show that the figure on my left represents vulnerability, but the one on the right is for viability. So once the good measures are put in place, I mean, they will transition from a state of vulnerability to viability, which is the right one. And that's what we are all looking for. And it's a case for I mean, the two communities, Anlo Beach and then Ankobra. So in conclusion, Anlo Beach and Ankobra, they are moderately vulnerable fishing communities. The fact that they are moderately vulnerable doesn't mean they should be left like that. And I think there should be some interventions to move them completely from a state of vulnerability, moderate vulnerability, to viability, a state of viability. And then flooding, the study also established that flooding, erosion, pollution, food insecurity, inadequate specialized skills are some of the factors that contributed to the moderate vulnerability of these two communities. So before I bring my presentation to an end, I would like to acknowledge some institutions and then some groups of people who helped to make this study a reality and successful. First of all thanks are due to V2V Global Partnership being led by Professor Pratik Nayak for providing the space for us to work and to identify the various factors that have been making these two communities vulnerable, and as well as the factors that will make these two communities viable. We are very grateful. Aside that, you have done so many things for us, and you have made it possible for us, the young ones, to learn a lot in this project or under this project. We are very, very grateful. And then the team is also grateful to Africa Center of Excellence in Coastal Resilience, whose director is Professor Dennis Walanyo Aheto, who is also the acting VC of this noble university. he has also done so well. He provided the avenue for us to showcase our skills, showcase our knowledge, and then let me say academic career. We are very grateful. To advance our academic career, they have been very instrumental in that, trying to make sure that we get the necessary resources to advance our academic careers. And then some field assistants. I mean, those who were on the field with me to gather data, Dr. Adade, Richard Adade, Richmond, Crime, Vinolia, Power, Esinam, they've done so well. They have been very supportive. Lois Blay, they've been very supportive. The relationship was so cordial. When you went to the field, I mean, it was so marvelous. It was good. Thank you so much. Keep up the good work you are doing, the collaboration that you are doing. And then special thanks go to the fisher folk who also made time to accommodate us, to receive us, and to provide relevant information for putting this study together. These are some of the references. Thank you so much for your attention. Questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Hito and Dr. Alizi. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Getting deeper into the understanding of vulnerability and possible ways to look at what does the future look like. So I would say a very strong presentation on the theoretical, conceptual part as well as the methodological part, but also kind of telling the story in its various nuances. This is very encouraging, and thank you very much. So we have questions. We have about 15 minutes to 20 minutes time for questions. So I'm going to read out some of the questions that we have already started to receive, and I would request both of you to respond as briefly as you can, so that we can take more questions from the audience. So the first one is from Akash Kaur, and Akash is asking and saying, great presentation and hope all is going well. Okay, apparently Akash knows you guys. What methods did you use to get data to measure erosion? Was it mostly using drone or also interview data?
So could you please repeat the question? I think the voice.
Okay, so he's asking, what methods did you use to collect data on the erosion? Was it only drone or also interview data?
So if I can get you clearly, you want to find out whether I used drone to gather the, yes, we used drone to do that.
Okay, he is asking whether it was only drone or you used other methods like interviews.
So we used drones, and then you also use satellite data that were in existence for that. Okay. And then we also conducted interviews to gather data, more or less like ground truthing. It was also done, yes, to gather more information.
Okay, so move on to the next question now. So from Kofi Agboga, and Kofi is asking, saying, good afternoon. My name is Kofi Agboga. Hence, excellent to raise the flooding issues, especially at Ankobra, where the community is knee deep in water twice daily. How have they adapted? How have they adapted to the frequent flooding in Ankobra?
In Ankobra, okay. So that's a good question. In fact, the community members have been struggling. I remember when you were there gathering data, at high tide, water was entering their homes. Now, the best they could do is to ensure that their properties that are delegate are kept away from the Tada flood. So if it's about, let's say, and something valuable, talk about TV, talk about how do you call it, radio, computers, and all that. They have to ensure that those things are kept away from the flood. But otherwise, as it stands, they have not really developed the adaptive capacity to withstand those hazards. There's water running through, sometimes through the streets, and there's nothing they can do. That's why they are calling for groins to be constructed to prevent the water from entering the communities. So there's nothing much that they are doing. More or less, they are helpless at the moment.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for the answer. The next question is from Alida Bandi, and Alida says, "Very interesting presentation, Evans.
It's
Well done."
from Alida, right?
Yes, yes. And Alida says, "Excellent presentation. Well done, Evans. My apologies, but I have to leave for another meeting. However, I am curious what indicators you use to measure sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity."
Okay. So for exposure, you were looking at the type of their housing. Is it made up of mud? Is it made up of concrete? Is it made up of block bricks and all that? That's for how do you call it? Exposure. Okay. And then you're also looking at the closeness to the water body. So those that are close to the water body, they influence, how do you call it? They face or they experience the hazards. And others that are interior, they mostly not so exposed to the hazards. In fact, there's a graph to that effect, but for the purpose of this presentation, that has been shelved for now. That gives you the spatial view, okay, of which houses are exposed to the hazards. And then for sensitivity, you were looking at the livelihood. During flooding, are they able to smoke fish properly? Because once it floods, where they are supposed to smoke their fish, I mean, they are all covered with water. So you're also trying to look at that. And so during the hazards, is it the case that they are out of business? You also try to look at that. And then adaptive capacity, you were trying to look at food, whether they were able to get food to eat during the period of, during the occurrence of the hazard, were they able to get food to eat? So these are, just to mention a few, these are some of the key indicators that were used to measure that. Yeah, and but as for vulnerability, it's just a function of exposure, sensitivity, and then adaptive capacity. Yes. All this will be detailed out in the report that will be shared with V2V Global Partnership.
Great. Yeah, that's exactly I was going to ask. So yes, the details would appear in the report, in the final case study, and this will be available for everyone to read publicly. So thank you, Evans and Dennis. So the next question is from Gaji Nurul Islam from Malaysia, and Gaji writes, "Dr. Ariji, excellent presentation. Based on your experience and given the circumstances in the two case study sites, do you think the communities are likely to be more vulnerable?"
If you can take the last part again.
Yeah, I mean, saying given what you have presented, do you think that these communities are likely to be more vulnerable? You showed some nice figures.
Yeah. So looking at the status quo, if no intervention is put in place, they are going to be vulnerable.
Mhm.
They are going to be forever vulnerable unless they relocate. Because in the case of Ankobra, as I said, during high tide, water is running through their homes. So imagine if they are to use this floor oven to prepare food. They cannot do that. They can't prepare food. So if you don't have gas or whatever, it's going to be very difficult for you to prepare food. So if nothing is being done about that, they are forever going to be vulnerable. And so the construction of the growing is very critical. You have to look at that so that the water doesn't get to them. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But
yes. So
also,
maybe if I may also, Prateep, maybe
please.
also contribute to that question. Um, you know, the issue is quite grave, as has been shown by the data and the presentation that Evans has made. So there are several factors that are converging to create the issues of vulnerability, not just the environmental degradation resulting from mining activities that are polluting the river bodies, which is a key issue. But there is also the issue of fisheries overexploitation, and then the challenge of climate change. So these are three major factors that are enhancing the sensitivity and lowering the adaptive capacity to some extent, and of course, exposure. So you can see there are multiple factors that are converging to create a problem. So if nothing is done, uh, given the factors that were looked at in terms of the political, ecological, and social ecological issues, certainly we moving the communities from a state of vulnerability to viability will not work. So one of the things that perhaps we could look at as a follow-up project or a follow-up activity to be very serious policy engagement, especially at the district level, and also some political activities, some conference meetings needs to be organized as quickly as possible, to bring this to the attention of policymakers. That is not to say they are not aware, but sometimes I think it's important that data is made available, for discussion also within the corridors of power. Because if nothing is done, certainly the problem is going to escalate. And so we just have to do something about that. At our level within the center, we will certainly draw this to the attention of those that need to hear. We hope that we will be able to make some inroads in that direction. Thank you.
That's wonderful. I mean, through our understanding of these case studies, what we are also finding that, vulnerability or viability are not absolute, so there are, you see glimpses of vulnerability and glimpses of viability in the same community. So certain aspects of their life are more vulnerable than other aspects, and therefore there are other, some aspects that are still viable. So to say that the community is entirely moving towards vulnerability or viability could be problematic. So we could discuss that further in the other context of other case studies, but I just wanted to put that on table that it's not a complete vulnerability of a system of or a community that is often seen through this researches. So when your intervention in terms of the policy and other things that you were talking about, Dennis, could target the specific aspects of community life and environment that are vulnerable, and therefore really improve on the aspects that are still showing signs of viability in many, so it's a juggling game, all the time. Okay, so we'll move on to next questions. I know time is running out, but the next question is from our colleague Aliou Shal from Senegal. Aliou writes, congratulations, dear colleagues, excellent presentation. I would like to seize this opportunity to know more about the difference you make between coping and adaptation that can be a short process. So what is the, how do you, see coping and adaptation in your case study site, because coping can be a certain process. Adaptation has a time tag on it. It could be more long term.
Okay. Prof, would you want to come in?
Okay. So it's saying
yes. I mean, these are coping and adaptation are interrelated concepts. I mean, one is able to cope when you are able to. I'm sorry, I'm getting some multiple feedbacks through phone calls. Just 1 minute. Yes, I'm sorry about that. I'm talking from the phone. So, yeah, when we talk about coping mechanisms, these are situations where people are able to kind of accept the situation they find themselves in, and so put in place measures that can help them alleviate the situation to some extent without fully addressing the issue to a larger extent. Adaptation, I understand or see it more as a concept that has a long-term perspective that could address the issue, the challenges that communities face from a long-term basis. In situations where, for instance, livelihood comes into the center of the issue, you're able to adapt to be able to address the challenge and sustain the livelihoods to a larger extent. Coping provides some short-term measure, and in that case, you may not want to focus on livelihoods, but other forms of activities that protects the system. And so they are both kind of interrelated, but quite different. Whilst one looks at a more short-term measure in terms of coping, the adaptation assumes a longer-term perspective. Thank you.
But there are specific links between coping and adaptation. Some coping actions and responses may be leading to adaptation in the context.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So now move on to next question. Peter Kusana, and Peter is writing, great presentation. Are there any actions from the community that is also contributing to their vulnerability? Are there any internal factors at the community level that are leading to their own vulnerability, other than the external drivers?
Oh, okay. Well, some winning was cited. I mean, there were some instances where some people were winning sand, and so that could be a contributory factor. Yeah. And then at Anlo Beach, some were cutting down mangroves, which were supposed to buffer or to soak the water, but they were cutting them for firewood. So some of these can contribute to that. And then in terms of pollution, they didn't really have a good place to dispose of their refuse. So they were siting their refuse around the surrounding, and that's also not good. Was contributing to the hazard. So these are some of the things that were observed.
I think there is a nice clue here, in terms of enriching the theoretical framework of exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity. It doesn't talk about drivers, it all talks about exposure and sensitivity. So maybe through your work you could try to incorporate the role of drivers in that exposure sensitivity and the adaptive capacity interactions. To say, and then in the drivers, you could look at internal dynamics and internal drivers as well as external drivers influencing the level of exposure and sensitivity. Just a lead, in some way. So I will move on to our last question now, because I know time. We are at time. This is from Derek Armitage, and Derek is writing, Evans, thanks a lot to you and Dennis. I really appreciate the case study and the practical strategies to build viability and resilience. As you were undertaking this analysis, did you get a sense if offshore trawlers were also a driver of vulnerability, like coming too close to inland waters and damaging nets, creating conflicts for small-scale fisheries?
You mean conflict?
Yeah, conflict, especially from the role of, offshore trawlers.
Well, I think conflict was not so pronounced. As a matter of fact, in terms of gender, both males and females had free access to the resources that were available. So the conflict was not so outstanding. But anyway, at Ankobra, some people were claiming that they were true natives, and others were they perceived others as non-natives. So there was some restriction, but it wasn't so pronounced anyway. In the first instance, the resources there are not so many. I mean, they are not abundant. And so there was nothing much to fight over. So conflict was not all that outstanding.
Yeah. Maybe an area to further look at, stretching out into the ocean to see, what other major actors play a role in the vulnerabilities of these local communities. Okay, so I know we are at time, but thank you very much. So to do this, the inaugural case study series, and we'll hear more from other countries in the subsequent months, as we have already promised. But thank you to you both, Dennis and Evans, for kickstarting this B2B case study series and really opening up discussion in such a nice way. And there is much to follow up, and I'm sure colleagues from all over the B2B Global Partnership would follow up on this, and then we will be having more opportunities to talk about the issues that you have raised, the interesting analysis that you have done. So thank you once again, and thank you to the audience for those wonderful questions and staying patiently with us for the extra minutes that we took today. So before I end, I would like to invite you all to the February B2B thematic webinar series focused on our B2B case studies on the 27th of February. And we are proud to announce that we're going to present the Senegal B2B case study in February, led by Ali Shal at Credited. So look forward to seeing you in February, and goodbye for now. Thank you very much once again. Bye-bye.